So welcome to those of you that have come along to the bioinformatics session today. My name's Robert Flatman. I'm a biochemistry manager in a large private pathology laboratory in Australia, a member of the Sonic healthcare companies around the world. I should really declare up front that I dabble in IT a lot. So even though I'm a biochemist, I do a lot of computer work developing new systems for our laboratories, but I also dabble in pathology harmonization, and I'm sort of fairly passionate that the profession's got homework to do. We can do better when it comes to standardizing the things that we do, and some of those groups down the bottom are groups that I work with. So the AACB is the Australasian Association of Clinical Biochemists. The RCPA is the Australian or the Australasian Royal College of Pathologists, our pathologists group, and they've been running some pathology standardization initiatives for a number of years now. And I'm also currently the chair of a terminology group, the IFCC and our UPAC, Committee for Nomenclatures, Properties and Units. So I just want to declare that up front because I am going to be talking particularly about how e-health and e-health records are going to change pathology as we know it. And we're used to being in control in pathology, but I think some of this stuff is going to start taking us out of our comfort zone. And different people have different ideas about what e-health is going to look like and what it's going to do. But generally there's still an awful lot of paper, particularly in hospitals. Even where paper has been replaced by electronic systems, we really don't do a great job of hooking those systems together. And some themes there that I'll talk about later on. And the financial world has been doing this stuff for many years. We all take for granted that when we travel around the world, we're going to be able to whip our credit card out and pay for whatever takes our fancy. We really haven't got anything like that portability with our health or with our pathology. And the financial portability, it didn't come easily. It happened over many, many years, and there was a lot of work over the last 30, even 40 years to get the computerized systems up to scratch. So many countries have got a lot of homework to do to get going with their e-health. And we're all aware that everyone's health systems are under pressure. We're all being told to do more with less. And pathology is always finding its budgets getting wound back. And certainly people that I've heard present or I've had the luxury of meeting from around the world, it's rare that they've got enough money and enough time to do all the things they want to do. So e-health is something that the industry and the politicians and everyone hopes will add some value. So there's some themes I'm going to be speaking about today, and I'll touch on why pursuing e-health is a good thing. I'll talk a little bit about what different countries have done, because webinars give us the luxury of being able to talk internationally, and in my experience, labs don't do a great job of standardizing with the lab down the road, let alone standardizing globally. And that's something that's probably going to have to follow eventually. So what are the implications for pathology? And I've said I'm mainly a pathology diagnostics person, so keep that in mind if I'm a little bit biased. And I want to talk about some of the tools of the trade that are available. And I guess in my experience, people don't always know about these tools. We're all busy being good pathologists and scientists. We don't always know about the state-of-the-art IT tools and how to use them. That's someone else's problem. But I would hope I've convinced you by the end of this presentation that it's something that the pathology profession's actually got to have ownership of. So what's it going to mean to all of us? And hopefully I've made the point now that there really is a lot of unnecessary variation between laboratory practice. In my experience within cities or within states or within countries, most organizations have actually done a pretty good job of following guidelines and standardizing what they do within organizations. And I know there have been a lot of initiatives within the laboratories that I operate within But when you compare between labs, there can be some scary variation. And I'd contend to you that e-health records are going to mean that patients are going to see their results, they're going to want to know what they mean, and if someone doesn't explain it to them, they're going to whip out Google and try and find out themselves. And sometimes that can be a bit dangerous for us as well. And when I talk about dangerous variation, this is just an example report from one of the local standardization initiatives. It's not a real report, but it's just making the point that we know within Australia we've got labs that put the most recent results on the right-hand side of the screen, or the right-hand side of the report. We've got other laboratories that put it on the left-hand side. And it drives our local clinicians crazy. They can't understand why we can't even agree on something as basic as that. It's actually potentially quite dangerous if you think about it. If a patient's getting worse, the last thing that you want is someone reading the report back to front. So ideally, we want a common language for the tests that we order and the test panels. And I know within my country, and I suspect a lot of countries, the test panels, the liver functions, the routine electrolytes, the renal function, and also other panels, iron studies, etc. There's often a lot of confusing variation between what laboratories will perform when a clinician orders a test. And something else I see is that pathology labs have actually seen that as an advantage. They feel that their local experts should be able to put into the report what they feel reflects their knowledge. However, there's a bit of a balancing act there between labs adding value by doing something different versus just doing nonsensical variation, which is really going to leave people scratching their heads. So we'll just quickly whiz through a little section I've got here on e-health, and I think this is obvious to anyone who's familiar with the area, but most developed countries are dealing with rapidly aging population, a lot of chronic disease and comorbidities to deal with, so the patient that walks in the door is often very complex to treat. And just on the top right here is a typical sort of population distribution for a developed country in 1911. So mainly young people, and survival rates meant that by the time we got into 70s and 80s, there weren't a lot of us left around. Below that is a coloured graph of men and women in Singapore, and that's projected a few years into the future. But people have described that so-called coffin shape, where there's going to be this bulge of people in their 50s and later, which is really going to stress out our health system. So we know that we're going to have some major challenges as we move into the future. And e-health promises more portable records, better outcomes, better safety. And I'll touch on some of these things from the point of view of the clinician and the patient. So the patient hopefully would expect to get better access to their records, and certainly that's a bit of a novelty in Australia. It's actually been relatively tricky to get a copy of your results. You could write in and get one, but most people don't bother jumping through the hoops in Australia. So I think that's one thing we've noted, is that patients are generally quite keen to see their results, and they're curious, but they also want to have more control. They would expect to get better services in terms of billing, making appointments and prescriptions. There's the hope of online support, which is great for regional areas, but adds an extra complexity to the doctor-patient relationship if it's not necessary. And there's evidence to suggest patients will pay a little bit more for these services, perhaps not always. A big thing that people forget sometimes is that we know there's a lot of medical errors happening, and e-health offers the promise of reducing that. If we could even reduce those errors just a little bit, that would make a huge benefit to the patients and also a benefit to the financial systems. There's also a risk, however, when you're designing software, that you won't get it quite right. And there have been documented cases in the literature, like this reference down the bottom here, where people have actually ended up treating patients incorrectly based on misreading the information in the health record, and that's obviously not a good situation. So clinicians want to make sure that they're understood. They don't really want their patients being too educated if it's anecdotal information. They'd prefer that it's evidence-based. It can be difficult if you're dealing with a patient who's not physically at hand. It costs time and money for surgeries, hospitals, clinicians in many settings to set themselves up to deal and to learn how to deal with this technology and the software. And there's always the issue of security for the patients and the doctors, and that's a major concern in the online environment. So you may have heard recently eBay was hacked, and they really don't know how much information was lost, and so it wouldn't be a good look if the local government e-health record was hacked. So most governments are spending a lot of time and money on making sure that doesn't happen. And there's medico-legal issues, and the medico-legal issues aren't just with the new processes. It's also we find in the pathology arena when we start talking about standardizing. A common concern I get if we get an influential member of a pathology discipline to come to the table, one of the questions they'll often ask first is, what's the worst case scenario if I get this wrong? And without fail, I can generally convince them that we know there's so much variation already in pathology systems that they can't really, anything they do is going to make things better. But there is the risk of medico-legal action. Governments would like to see things run more efficiently and be cheaper. They'd like that there isn't much political fallout. They've got the problem of trying to keep everyone happy, which adds dangerous complexity. And it's not a good thing when you start an IT project with complexity. Ideally, you want a rock-solid business case that everyone's going to use and then build on that. That's not always the way that these things start out. And you've got to figure out which horse you're going to back and who you're going to sponsor. So I'm going to whiz through some countries. It's probably going to be a very cursory overview, but I'm just going to go through and have a look at a snapshot of some various countries, and just glancing at the email addresses of some of you that are online at the moment. As I expected, a lot of you are based in America, but I think we've had a couple of people from overseas pop in and out. So forgive me if I don't talk about your country or if I don't give your country enough coverage, but it's probably fair to say a lot of countries, and Australia's no different, have really struggled to get good policy in place. To do it well is expensive. There's resistance to change for a lot of reasons. It can be a dangerous political exercise, and sometimes people are left wondering if it really is worth the trouble to get on the horse and try to ride it. So I thought it would be interesting just to touch on some of the success stories and some of the places that these programs have got bogged down. So in developing nations, we know that many developing nations have actually had the opportunity to leapfrog an entire generation of communications infrastructure. And there's a hope that some of the leverage these countries are getting off smartphones will pay dividends in the e-health and health arena. So there's been some clever projects in some countries around common morbidities like diabetes, age support, nutritional planning, and certainly some of these countries have put in place payment options with mobile phone infrastructure that challenge or surpass what's available in developed countries. So it's not always a valid assumption that developing nations are behind us. They've got access to the latest technology, even if their budgets aren't always as great. In Europe, there's actually some really good examples of e-health that's being well governed and is making a difference for patients and clinicians. So I'm aware personally that the Czech Republic and the Scandinavian countries are particularly active, and some of my work with the NPU terminology organization that I mentioned earlier brings me in contact with Danes and other Europeans, and it's impressive what they've achieved in over a period of time. So certainly in Denmark, there's been active initiatives for many years, and they've succeeded in getting standards and good terminology in place. They're getting leverage. They've got very good governance from their government organizations, and they've had online portals which are being used throughout the health system regularly for a number of years since the mid-2000s. And there's been speculation why that's the case. that there is a slightly smaller population. It's easier to get the key movers together. The population's generally IT savvy, and probably it's been a huge help that that there's been the population has accepted being given a number, and so either a registry number or personal identification numbers. So that makes it a lot easier to have centralized systems and know that who you're dealing with. It's not something that is readily accepted. I know in Australia, and I'll talk about that in a moment, people have resisted being given a number. In the UK, there are some good initiatives in place. It's my understanding that they don't go into a lot of depth in terms of the clinical information which is available to the patient and the clinician. However, there has been a move to at least get demographics available so that as you move through the health system, that basic information is available. In more recent years, there's been audits and concerns that for all the money invested, there hasn't been a lot of positive outcome. And so certainly I think it's fair to say the NHS is probably still struggling to come up with a really bulletproof implementation. I don't know a lot about the US, but I believe that there's been moves in lots of areas for over many years, but there hasn't been a coordinated e-health plan since 2009. There's a lot of money being plowed into Obamacare and other initiatives. There's been incentives for medical practitioners to move into the medical software arena, but probably it's fair to say security and privacy conflicts and concerns between state and federal law and patients and clinicians have been an issue to deal with. And I said I'm from Australia, and so hopefully you can understand my broad Aussie accent, but we've had particular challenges getting started. There's frustration in Australia that we've been talking about a lot of initiatives for many years, and we're struggling to really get too far down the road. For the last 18 months, we've had the so-called PC EHR, a personally controlled e-health record, available, and we've had a governance from a government organisation, the National E-Health Transition Authority. We haven't been able to convince people to receive a smart card which identifies them for the health system. There was a concern that that was going to be too big brotherish, and the government would have access to too much information from coordinated databases if we did that. So we do have the PCEHR, but it's an opt-in system, and most Aussies have decided that they couldn't be bothered and they haven't opted in. That's a very broad generalization, and there's many thousands of these things, hundreds of thousands of them have been set up, but we're struggling to get critical mass of this thing. So we've had a major review in recent months, which was only released very recently, and it's identified the fact that probably our opt-in model should change to an opt-out to encourage more people. There needs to be a better emphasis for clinicians and patients on the benefits and emphasizing the security, possibly even to the extent of people receiving an SMS to say that someone is accessing their e-health record, so that you can check whether that's appropriate or not. I should warn you that I'm going to talk about initiatives in Australia quite a bit, because that's obviously my area of expertise, but I'm led to believe that some of the things we've done are typical of other countries, and where they're not, if someone gets a good idea, well that's productive as well. So we've been active since the 90s with interchange formats for pathology, which have actually been quite successful, and so successful they've proved a little bit difficult to unwind. As I said, NETA came online in the mid-2000s, and towards the end of the 2000s and the last few years, we've had a number of standardization initiatives, and I'll talk about these a little bit more later, but you'll hear me talking about PUTS and PITUS, and this is the Pathology Units and Terminology Standardization Program in 2011, and a follow-up project called PITUS in 2013, where an I was added in for information, pathology information, terminology, and units standardization. I'll touch on those in more detail later, but I'm now going to go into pathology in more detail. Now I'm going to talk about these things. This is probably the crux of my talk, and what needs to be done, who can make it happen, who pays for it, what tools have we got? And as I said earlier, I find most pathology laboratorians don't always have a good grip on what tools are out there. So I'd like to talk about those, and I apologise if that's too basic a level, but I often find people, intelligent people in pathology, aren't aware of basic iTool and eHealth communication tools, and what's going to happen in the future with these systems. So let's have a look at what needs to be done. Uh, we know that what we've got, it may not be state of the art, and we know we want to make it better. And it's not always about the technology. It's often more about getting the right people in the room, getting them talking around the table, agreeing to standardize on how data is coded, and agreeing to change their systems over to the new super duper fast railway. And in pathology, we know we've been IT savvy for a long period of time. We had to be. But eHealth should help us get rid of the paper reports that we still generate for some people. Electronic requesting would cut out a huge layer of manual interpretation of scribbles on pieces of paper. And in Australia, we're starting to get a much higher level of electronic requesting, as much as 50% in some of our laboratories. But I know in Europe, they've got much higher levels of electronic requesting. Some of the sonic labs in other countries, on the other hand, have got very low levels of electronic requesting, and those laboratories would have a lot to gain from good e-health systems. Electronic reporting offers printers can be a very expensive thing to maintain on networks in terms of consumables and the software, so it would actually be very helpful for pathology to produce electronic results. And it also offers the possibility of novel mechanisms for reporting these things. There's traditionally a high investment in IT in pathology laboratories, so it is a good place to get leverage in the e-health system. However, pathologists aren't always invited to the table, but the reality is that a lot of the health system relies on pathology, and we probably need to speak up for ourselves and learn to sell ourselves better to government. It isn't always best to be first with IT, and sometimes it's better to just sit back and see. So ideally, many of us would like to be in the middle of the herd, and that makes it a little bit difficult when you're talking about initiatives for change, because people know that it takes time and money to change. But I would suggest to you, and I'll talk more about it later, that we're going to be forced to change faster than we might wish to by clinicians and patients that are asking difficult questions if we don't start getting our heads together and investing some effort into these things. And I said before that there's a lot of variation in pathology reports. Clinicians are often used to that, and they get reports from different practices. They get used to liking a certain type of report from a certain practice. The patients are not always so used to that, and they're probably the ones that will be asking more questions. So one of the concerns I often see with pathologists is that the risk that pathology is going to be reduced to a commodity. And the IT guys say, look, we've been sending these results around electronically for a long time. We can do this. It's not that difficult. But there's a lot of complexity in pathology sometimes that isn't immediately obvious. And it is a danger that people can make assumptions about how this data can be re-represented, taking from an atomic piece of data, putting it into a database where you're combining results from many laboratories, and you can get some difficult situations that make the original laboratory uncomfortable if they haven't had a say in how the electronic health record assembles those results. It would be very helpful, however, if laboratories were doing basic things the same. And I'm going to talk more about some specific things here, and this is an Australian bias because we're doing work in these areas currently, but I'd be interested to hear from some of you in the question and answer session towards the end, if you're aware of some local initiatives or you've got some feelings about these things. I know I said before with test profiles, there's two big problems. One is that laboratories have different ideas about how big a profile should be and what tests are essential, and there's obviously monetary concerns there. There's also an issue that many laboratories probably do more tests than they need to, and we've painted ourselves into a corner to a certain extent where it can be difficult to take away these tests. Clinicians aren't always happy when you take away a test like chloride, for example, which may add very little value in most patients, but you'll always get a complaint from someone who is looking for their chloride. I'm going to talk about formatting of results and the variations in how reports are represented. I'm going to talk about reference interval standardization and documenting reference intervals, some concepts around whether it's safe to combine or not combine results into eHealth records, and touch on so-called critical risk results, because many people don't realize that pathology reports nowadays rarely flag critical results. There have been initiatives in many countries around the world, and there's a bit of a bias in some of those things that I've thrown up from the Australia-New Zealand area, but there was some excellent work done in Europe over many years. The Nordic Reference Interval Project, NORIP, dates back to the year 2000, and Scandinavians are very sort of nonchalant about some of the fantastic work they did standardizing their reference intervals as far back as the end of last century. So I know in Australia we're getting close to standardizing some tests. I know in the UK, Pathology Harmony has been doing some good work in recent years. In Australia, we've had at least one annual scientific conference which was devoted to the topic of harmonization and standardization. These logos down the bottom relate to the PITIS project that I talked about before, which runs off government money. The New Zealand people have had some very good terminology standardization projects over many years. So I'll just keep moving, and I really do need to confess that I'm an Aussie, and I'm probably going to be a bit biased about some local initiatives. So you'll have to put up with that, and as I said, I'd be happy to hear from you if you've got some comments or whatnot later, but hopefully the themes that I talk about will have some interest to those of you from elsewhere in the world. So yeah, grab a beer and a sausage, and we'll see where we go. There was recently a harmonization workshop in Sydney, Australia, that I attended, and this was the third meeting we've had in recent years aimed at trying to get laboratories around Australia to use standardized reference intervals. And we know from previous years that a surprisingly large number of laboratories are willing to change what they currently use to a recommended set of harmonized Australian values. We've got very good data from large private laboratories like Sonic that I work for, but also a priori studies that have been done from the ground up with healthy patients, and one of the key studies was done in Canberra. And they've come back with data which was remarkably close to some of the data mining results that we got from our private pathology databases. And I've talked about the variation that we see in reports, but when it comes to reference intervals, the tests that we've looked at standardizing in Australia are the electrolytes, creatinine, some of the minerals, and just a few enzymes and total protein. And we feel that we can do all of those things with relatively little fuss. There's been a little bit of argy-bargy about what is a reasonable potassium interval and which laboratories may have pre-analytical issues. But in general, probably we would hope by the end of the year there will be many Australian laboratories moving to standardise reference intervals for these things. And you'll be able to read about that either on the AACB or the RCPA websites where there's some standardization initiatives underway. What we understand in laboratories by this column on the right-hand side here, it's not always on the right-hand side even, but we know they're not normal ranges. That's evil calling them that, but most of us now call them reference intervals. And pathology people know that there's actually a lot of different numbers that pop up in those columns. There's population limits, there's decision limits from experts, there's therapeutic values for drugs, and sometimes there's other more complex information that you want to link to. We probably don't explain that very well currently, and that's something that we need to educate our end users about. And it could be that novel electronic mechanisms let us do that. You wave your mouse over something and more information comes up in the background. But certainly in Australia, we're trying to just clarify to some of our IT and patient groups that there's actually a fair degree of complexity hidden in that column. And in fact, we've also asked laboratories, or we will ask laboratories when we soon put out our recommendations, that that column should probably just have a single word above it. They should just say reference rather than ref interval or the many other variations we've got. There's been some very good local work surveying pathology laboratories to get evidence on the variations that we have. And one of the things we've seen is that we now know that the standardization of our patient results is generally very, very good for those tests that I showed you before. However, embarrassingly, when we look at our reference intervals, because of the use of historical limits, and it's time-consuming and expensive to determine a good reference interval, because of that, often for routine biochemistry tests, we know our ranges have more variation in them than the analytical standardization in the test would make you think. So we can reliably measure a potassium to 0.1, 0.2. However, the variation in our reference intervals is often as much as 0.5 or 0.8 millimoles. I won't go into this in detail, but there was a good paper from Seist et al. That talked about these concepts, and it's probably a good thing for you to send patients or clinicians off to when they don't understand some of these terms around deriving reference intervals that we spout. We're going to put some recommendations out in Australia around things that seem basic to people that use pathology reports all the time, but we know there is some variation between labs, and we're going to say reference intervals should be inclusive. That is, if you've got a reference interval of 5 to 20, you should be flagging values of 4 or below, or 20, 21 and above. You should have the same number of significant figures for your results as you do for your patients, and the flagging should be based on that as well. You shouldn't be looking to normalize your results. You shouldn't be looking to see if you're halfway down the reference interval or 90% through the reference interval. Because of the variation in intervals, we know that's not a good idea. There's difficulties in how you describe partitions. So for those laboratories that have very good pediatric values or pregnancy values and have invested time and effort into getting those, it's actually surprisingly difficult to describe them. And I won't dwell on this, but we've been debating some different ways of describing these things without resorting to too many less than, greater than, and mathematical symbols. And our final terminology will probably be a bit cleaner than that, but I would be interested to know of anyone who's found a perfectly safe way of saying what 1 to 3 years of age means. Does that mean your 3rd birthday or the entire 3rd year of your life? And I know that 2 intelligent people can be standing right next to one another and have completely different concepts in their head for what 1 to 3 years means, and both be convinced that they're correct. And that's something that we can't tolerate going into the future. We need to all be thinking and documenting the same way. There's a lot of variation in flagging, and I won't touch on this, but some people use asterisks, some people use bold, some people use color. There needs to be some sort of local agreement on what is reasonable. And I won't dwell on that too long, but we've got a lot of variation in Australia. With units, there have been some good initiatives around drugs in Australia saying that we should all now use gravimetric units, and that's miffed a lot of people who'd gone to effort to use SI units, which we routinely use for pathology in Australia. However, there was an expert group with not just pathologists that looked at this and felt that there was a very good argument for not using molar units. So you're welcome to look up that paper in the Medical Journal of Australia if you wanted to see more about why we did that. Formatting of results is an area that, again, there's huge variation between laboratories. I won't dwell on this other than to comment that even in terms of rounding, there can be some silly variations. So I often find scientists in our laboratory, I'm embarrassed to say, that will dilute an amylase 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000 and seem happy to report it as 123,507. And I sort of ask them if they're really sure about the 7 units per litre. So we probably don't do a good job of standardizing our rounding, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. I'm just going to touch on so-called critical results, and experts on critical or critical risk results can spend all day arguing about the terminology for them. But certainly in Australia, we're soon going to put out some guidelines on what we feel are the basics for how people should handle critical results. And generally, most laboratories in Australia don't flag these on reports. We rely on some sort of follow-up override method, and that's generally a phone call, which is documented in our LISs that we've reached someone, we've communicated that a result is potentially life-threatening or is going to have a lot of impact on the future treatment of the patient, and we make note of that. So there's a group in Australia which is working on some consensus guidelines, and I believe in America CLSI is close to putting out some guidelines on critical results as well, which is probably worth being on the lookout for. Much of what we've done in Australia has really been focused on getting the basics in place for paper reports, and we probably should have done it a long time ago. But at least we're doing it now. People often say to me, well, you know, we're in the electronic era now, isn't this a bit old hat? But you really need to come up with recommendations that work in both arenas, and it may well be that in the future we'll do other clever things, but we have to get the foundation stones in place before we can build on those. Something which we've done a little bit of work in Australia, but we recognised early on was a problem when you start combining results from different laboratories. Is it safe to combine the troponin result from the laboratory down the road, the troponin T with the troponin I from the public hospital up the road? And of course, if it's a different analyte, then you shouldn't put them on the same line in a report. But if it's the same analyte but a different immunoassay manufacturer, you can have some fairly exciting variations in the standardization of the results, how the assays respond to the sample itself. And it's quite a challenge sometimes to figure out if two assays give similar patient results. And even if they do for normal patients, they may not do it for abnormal patients. And so we've started the process of trying to find answers to some of these questions in Australia. We've put out some very rough guidelines for about 70 or 80 tests, but we've recognised that this is going to be a potentially time-consuming, difficult exercise in the future, but something that does need to be dealt with. So we've actually taken a leaf out of the English Harmonization program and stolen their traffic light system, which we think has got a lot of benefit, and we flagged tests that we know would be dangerous, and tumour markers are often a good example of that. Tumour markers can have a lot of variation between different immunoassays, so most of those we have flagged as red. Green is things that we know we've got information, whether QAP or reference interval studies or bias studies, that shows that you've got very good agreement between laboratories. And there are some analytes where that is the case, and they can be flagged green. But the ugly reality for us in Australia, and I suspect a lot of countries, is that the vast majority of pathology tests probably fall into this we just don't know category. And we've got a lot of homework to do there. I won't dwell on that because I probably need to get through my slides a bit faster. So I think I've got that concept across. But the one point I want to make is this is an area that the pathologists need to show leadership, whether medical pathologists or our laboratory scientists. There's a lot of complexity in pathology which isn't obvious to IT people, to clinicians or patients who don't measure things for a living, and we probably need to do a much better job of communicating that complexity, and one way of doing it is the traffic light system I mentioned. So who makes these changes happen? In Australia we've got lots of bodies with logos. Some of these are overseas groups, but the reality is, to get good standards, you need input from lots of different professional groups. So you need people from the different disciplines within pathology, but you also need experts from outside pathology. And you need probably patient representation, clinicians, government representation if you're trying to get government money. Medical software vendors like to know what's going on because their livelihood depends on these things. So the more of these people you have around the table, the greater the likelihood that the recommendations will be accepted. There's also obviously a greater chance that you'll get bogged down in complexity. So provenance and governance are very important principles in this arena. You need the right people who people will recognize in the profession. And so if you've got someone with a reasonable amount of clout, then if guidelines put out with their name on it, hopefully laboratories will follow. And we've seen that happen in Australia with some of the harmonization work that we've done. We've had some very senior people from our pathology advisory committees, and people do seem to have taken notice. You need IT experts to explain to the pathology people how the IT systems work, and they need to be able to communicate. And you need a willingness for people to get involved. And you also need people to be willing to follow up regularly and look at how the goalposts are changing. So I'm not going to spend much time on these Australian groups. I've mentioned NETA. There's a lot of laboratory scientific groups in Australia, and to differing extents they've tried to do work in the e-health arena, and it's generally not incredibly well accepted. The only way we've got good runs on the board in recent years was by all of the scientific societies, and I'm most heavily involved with the Biochemistry Society, which happens to be listed up the top. Maybe that's alphabetical, or maybe I'm biased. But I'm from the AACB, but I've recognised that I'm not going to get my message across unless I join the broader arena of our College of Pathologists, which represents all of the pathology disciplines. And they're the people that have got the best links with government. And so people listen when they put out guidelines. So in recent years, any guidelines that any of the scientific societies have contributed to, and many of the societies have slotted into these programs, we end up putting our guidelines out with a stamp on it, not just the RCPA, but as many of the other groups involved as we can. I'm not going to dwell on how some of these guidelines were developed. I think I'll just keep the pace up and move through this. I mentioned that we've had a couple of programs which seem to be getting results. PITUS, the follow-up program, which is still currently running, is scheduled to put out guidelines within the next few months in a number of arenas around the requesting and reporting of pathology. And it's also got some government money to reward people that accept the guidelines and start using them. So what tools do we have to get out good e-health pathology results? And I've used the railroad analogy. I'm going to touch on a concept called interoperability, which I find some people know about and often pathology people don't. And railways is a good analogy. For many years in Australia, we had states that actually had railways that looked like this. Rather than standardise on something between states, we knew that when a train crossed the border, it was going to be a different size. So we had this crazy system where we were trying to do 2 or 3 different types of railways at once. You don't want to be doing that. So the first problem you have when you transmit information between people or systems is you need to be able to transmit the information. That's so-called technical interoperability, and in health messaging that's done with the HL7 system, and you won't be able to read that message, but I encourage you to read about HL7 if you want to know more about the basic messaging level. More important to us as pathology people is semantic interoperability, and this is making sure the meaning of the message is understood. And good terminology allows us to communicate information between computer systems, whether they're LISs or hospital laboratories, effectively. You don't want to be mapping a couple of thousand terms from your LIS to multiple computers. It's a lot of work. If you do it through a common terminology, then if everyone's speaking the same language, it should save a lot of work. And so good terminology lets you not only describe disease and pathology, but it also lets you request and code data in a very useful form for later. The concepts of pre and post coordination are important. So I don't know if you're aware, but pre-coordination is where you have a terminology which describes complex relationships with a single term, such as a test 24-hour urinary creatinine would have a single term which describes it. Post-coordination is where you individually describe these terms and you concatenate together the mathematical terms that describe them into a single relationship. So you end up with a much bigger term, but you've got more power to code. A big problem with pre-coordinated systems is that you can very rapidly get a so-called combinatorial explosion of terms. And you don't want too many terms, otherwise you're increasing the chances that different laboratories will be using different terms. I want to just quickly touch on the fact that there are three terminologies. SNOMED is a monster terminology for coding medicine. LOINC is probably the most popular pathology coding system around the world. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention the NPU, which it runs out of the IFCC and IUPAC, and is one of the older terminologies, but probably not as well funded as some of the others. I haven't got time to go through the slides I've put in here about these terminologies, but I would encourage you to go and read about SNOMED, LOINC, and the NPU if you're not already familiar with these terminologies. But they vary in terms of how they describe terms. They vary in how challenging it is to develop local code sets to constrain people from having too much variation in their codes. In Australia, we had problems with individual laboratories selecting items, and then later on we realized we had an awful lot of variation because we hadn't discussed the codes that we were developing. So we're now working hard to try and remove that variation. The NPU terminology is probably unusual in that it's one of the terminologies which references each term in the database back to other databases. And certainly because we've got access to the resources of IUPAC, and IUPAC does databases very well because they're the people that run the periodic table, for example, but they also have very good metrology links. So some of these terminologies differ in how well their terms are developed. And some of the definitions are very ad hoc, whereas some of the other terminologies are founded in very sound scientific principles. And there's variations in how easy it is to read these things between countries sometimes as well. But the last big area that I'm going to touch on is who's going to maintain these systems and how do we develop them. And I've just got some slides here suggesting to you that it's either volunteer work, it's either government funded or a mixture, or user pays. And user pays isn't always terribly successful in this arena. I've talked a lot about the Australian situation where we do have cross-disciplinary groups, and we found that was the only way to get success in developing these things. But it's not something that you do once and it's done forever. The evidence base is constantly growing and changing, and we need to update these terms as we go. I won't dwell on combine, do not combine again. So I'd suggest to you that to get a really good product, it needs to be easy to use, and the iPhone took off because it was easy to use, and kids know how to use it when you give them one. But it isn't a given that programmers will always write great e-health software. So the end users, the patients, the clinicians, but also the pathology people need to be involved in this process. And I know in Australia, many of our software vendors have put little clever tricks in because they know that terminology currently isn't mature enough to describe terms that are regularly reported in Australia. Another concept that is important is the fact this isn't a straight line, the fact that you, as hard as you try to get a group of experts in the room and eventually get them to agree on something, often it's a Pareto principle where it's not worth trying to get 100% agreement on something on the day. More often than not, what you're dealing with is an incremental process where it might feel you're going around in circles, but in fact, over a period of years, you build on new technologies, new standards as they come online. And the JCTLM, the Joint Committee for Traceability in Laboratory Medicine, is a fantastic standardization initiative that wasn't available 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and without it we wouldn't have got as far as we have with a lot of standardization work nowadays. So that's an example of something that has become an important prerequisite. I think for those of you who are online and are pathology laboratory people, you know that you don't just automate something and expect that you whack a machine in and automate an existing process. You actually have to put a lot of thought into getting the best out of the next generation of technology. I must be getting old because I can see that smack picture's reversed. But as these things come online, you have to standardize the tubes that you've got. You have to standardize the process for how they're sent through the laboratory, and you have to work on your IT systems to make these things happen. And it's going to be the same for pathology laboratories in the e-health arena. We're going to have a lot of questions asked of us, and I think some of them are going to be embarrassing if we haven't got our heads together. So hopefully I've convinced you that there's a lot of initiatives underway in many countries that show great promise. Hopefully I've also convinced you that there is a lot of benefit in pathology in getting involved in those initiatives. There's good reasons why pathology professionals need to be communicating the complexity in the disciplines that we work in, but we also need to be learning about IT and what our customers want. And I think historically we've probably been a little bit too quick to tell the customer what they need rather than listen to what they want. So I would argue that there's never been a better time to look at harmonizing and standardizing pathology. I talked about the JCTLM and some of the fantastic initiatives the diagnostic industries and the profession have come up with, but we'll only get maximum benefit from that when everyone's playing together in the same sandpit. So just my final slide, e-health is accelerating in most countries. Patients and clinicians are going to come up with questions. We're going to need to respond to that, and it's going to happen in many areas at once, and it'll be interesting but challenging. It'll be time-consuming and expensive, but it should be worthwhile, but it will also require a constant input to maintain. So I've probably talked a little bit long there, so I'll just finish up on that slide, and I'll hand over to the question and answers session. So I would encourage any of you who've got any comments to make from your country or any questions about my presentation to have a go and type in some questions on your screen there, and hopefully the organisers will help me sort out any questions that come up, and we'll have a look at them. So that's the end of my slides, and at this stage I haven't seen anyone hit me with any questions, so that's making it very easy for me to have an answer for everyone's questions. And thank you for all of you who came along today, and I should also take time out to thank the bioconference organisers for asking me to present. So certainly this is my first experience giving an international webinar, and I hope those of you that listened in found it useful. And if any of you have managed to get some decent ideas for local initiatives, then I'll have succeeded in my mission today. I can see just looking down the screen here that we do seem to have representation from quite a few different countries, so that's good to see. So if we're getting to the end here and there aren't any questions, then I'm probably going to close up shop soon. But again, I would just encourage you, if you've got any questions, don't be shy. Please type them in. But otherwise, we'll be closing up in 5 or 6 minutes, or maybe sooner. And I mean, if you haven't got a question for me, I would be curious to hear from anyone who has had some interesting work in this area. So please feel free to share any comments that you've got. I believe the slides from the presentation will get put up and be available for the next few weeks or a couple of months. So if you wanted to share these slides or any other presentation with someone, you're welcome to look those up on the bioconference website and have a look and go from there. So look, I don't think I've got any questions. So Jen, if you're still there in the background, I probably will close up shop at this point in time. And again, I'd like to thank everyone for taking the time to listen in on my presentation, and I hope that you got some value from it. Have a good day, everybody.